some of the logistics and the technology that was available then.
Yes. Well, you mentioned navigators a moment ago. That was the biggest fear, because if the navigators didn't know what the hell they were doing, and many of them were only, well, they're 20 years old, and they'd had about 6 weeks of studying in navigation. And if they got lost at all and it got dark, you couldn't find your home island. And if a lot of planes, I shouldn't laugh about it, flew around looking for their island, ran out of gas, and crashed into the ocean, and because the navigator couldn't find the island.
And that's the stuff you forget about. And like you said, as young kids. Before we get started, I got to do one thing first.
Yeah.
First and last name and the correct spelling, just so I have it on tape. So your first name is?
Maurice. Everybody calls me Buck, but it's Maurice.
Maurice.
Harmon, Harmon.
Okay. And you served in which Army Air Corps?
Army Air Corps, absolutely.
Army Air Corps.
Yes.
And Buck was not a pilot.
No, thank you. I was. If you want that, I was in charge of armament for the whole. Eventually, for the whole group, I was promoted from a squadron to group headquarters, and was in charge of all ordnance, armament, bombs, ammunition, guns, all that kind of stuff. Ammunition. So and I flew a few missions, but I sort of selected them. I didn't want to volunteer on some of the worst ones, which was, of all places, flying over Borneo with the Japanese oil fields.
Wow.
And like Ploesti in Europe, we lost so many planes on flying over that. Balikpapan was the town where all the oil fields were in Borneo, of all places to be bombing.
Now, I'll tell you what's amazing to me, and you're a good example, and I hope you won't take offense when I say this, but as we get more mature, sometimes it's hard remembering names and streets and things like that, but yet historically, you can tell me every name of a city, an island, oh, that's just clear as a bell to you, which I think is just always...
Mostly, isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
And I can't tell you what happened yesterday to me, but I'm 85 now, and my memory is getting worse and worse. And but I can remember most of the things back there, except people's names. I forget people who were very close to me.
Huh.
And some of the dearest guys that I remember being killed. I see them. I see these little blonde-haired kid, 24 years old. I loved that kid, and he was killed, and I can't remember his name. I can tell you he's from Minnesota, but I can't remember his name. So anyway.
Yeah, there's a lot for us to stick in our minds. Now, you were in the South Pacific,
Mm-hmm.
and there was an island that had, the Japanese had, what, phosphate mines on it?
Oh, that was Nauru.
Nauru.
The island we flew to, bear in mind, they flew us, first of all, from Hamilton Field, California, to Hawaii. And they separated us, remembering Pearl Harbor, the high command. They didn't want the 4 squadrons in a group to be in one airfield in Hawaii. They didn't want us all big bombed out, so we were in 4 different airfields. And I was in at that time, 372nd Squadron of the 307th. That was part of the 7th Air Force at that time in Hawaii, which was based in Hawaii. And so you asked me a question there.
Well, I'll clarify one thing too, because we talked about that. So this is early in the war.
This is we took off from California. I have to guess how many planes and crews we had in the whole bomb group, but I would estimate there was at least 24, possibly 28 planes and crews that took off from Hamilton Field just a very few days after everybody else, all ground crew, maintenance crews, supplies and everything else. We had what do they call those Army ships, Liberty ships, made by Kaiser down here. Took all the rest of the ground personnel, supplies, ammunition, guns, everything, and we followed by a few days before they took off. The combat crews took off from Hamilton Field, so we flew to Hickam Field in Honolulu, and then they told us where the squadrons would be based in different areas of Oahu. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. Now, as we record history,
Yeah, this
Yeah.
was 43, October 43.
October 1943, okay.
That was early, remembering that Pearl Harbor was, did I say 43? 42. It was 42.
Okay.
Pearl Harbor had been almost a full year in December 41. This was October 42.
So basically
Not quite a year yet.
Yeah. Now, historically, we always talk about the great things that America did during the war, and there were some things that might have happened that weren't so great, or there was some young people were trying to figure out the war. You've talked about the island, and again, I forget the name of I want to say Ranu, but that's not it. That had the Japanese phosphate mines on it. Nauru, that's it, Nauru. Tell me about what happened there, because that's a little different side of the war that we may not know. Now press-wise, the press said that the bombing of Nauru, which had phosphate
mines.
The press said it was wonderful, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you have a little different. You saw a little different view of the island than what the press saw.
Well, it was a different view of where we were based at the time. This would be important for your general knowledge. As I said early, we were in Hawaii. Our main mission, we found out, everybody thought they'd be in the battle right away, was flying search, because Pearl Harbor was still fresh in their memories, and they didn't want any sudden attack destroying a whole bomb group's airplane sitting on a airport somewhere, air base. And so we were in 4 different places. Suddenly, we were alerted to be ready for a mission. This was rather a surprise. I had no idea what the hell they had in mind, but it turned out to be Wake Island. This was our very first mission, let alone being the first thrust of the whole Allied forces in the world against the enemy. So, and the first thing to plan for was, this is a long, long way away. It was a couple thousand miles. So we had to fly to Midway first to refuel and tend to any other problems, and then from Midway to Wake. And so many ground officers, this being again early in the war, they thought they needed ground officers where you're going to land at Midway, check everything, check the bomb racks, check the bombs, almost each fucking bomb we had to look at it, everything on all those planes, because everybody was new and cautious. And ground crews to make sure you check the airplanes and so on and so forth. So all that was done on the ground at Midway, very quickly, very briefly, and from there on to Wake. And in returning, although the reports, as I read the old magazine reports, no planes were lost. It's true that no planes were shot by the enemy. A few machine gun holes they found, but no damage of any extent. But one plane was lost. It was lost, and nobody knows why, in returning. They apparently had some type of mechanical problem and ditched in the ocean somewhere, but they were never found out. So, but it was a very successful mission in terms of getting there, bombing a few buildings and so forth. And the island, Wake Island, was famous because that Marine major, when the same day that Pearl Harbor was attacked, the Japanese also attacked Wake Island. And that major, with his few Marines on that island, held off the Japanese attack for 2 or 3 weeks. So he became quite a hero. Name starts with a D, like Duncan or something like that. But so Wake Island was known and by the public. So that mission gave us one hell of a news release all over the world. All the pilots and their crews were taken to Hickam Field. They had a big parade. The Navy participated in this. Everybody had to wear their white uniforms in the Navy and so forth. All the flyers got distinguished flying, or the pilots did, the Distinguished Flying Cross, which is a rare medal to be given for just a routine flight. It really was only routine. But, so it was a big celebration, and the headlines in all the papers worldwide were known. So Wake, we're still identified with Wake Island. It's when it was certainly not the most difficult mission our bomb group ever flew. But that's the way it was. So after that,
And Wake was instrumental because it was the first basically aggressive
offensive as
Offensive.
against defense.
Yeah.
We actually flew an offensive mission. Shortly afterwards, in terms of dates and stuff, the next offensive mission of the Allied forces was General Clark landing in North Africa. And that was about 2 or 3 weeks, roughly, after our mission, and so that we were regarded by the press everywhere as the first Allied attack on the enemy. So it was more psychological than anything else, but it was useful psychologically. I mean, it helped the local American positive feeling about we are gaining on, and so on and so forth. And that was very important because, without any question, the industry of the United States was a tremendous participant in winning this war, and never done it without them. So that was the in line of the dates of all that stuff. And then when they realized, well, you can fly a good mission now, they being the high command, there was a mission assigned again, and not a big one. And then with the 4 squadrons in Hawaii flying search, and the war getting a little bit older, and the realization that we needed more attacks on the enemy, etc., they took 2 of the squadrons and flew them to Guadalcanal, which was the big island of the Pacific War at that time. And we were left, two squadrons, by coincidence, the one I was in at that time, we were left in Hawaii to continue flying search and maybe other occasions that might come up. Well, one of the maybes was this planning for us to fly to Funafuti, which was this island in the mid-Pacific. And in reality, they could have flown or 2 of those squadrons they had already sent to Guadalcanal. It takes a big map to understand this. Would have been closer to Funafuti than us flying from Hawaii. But for whatever reason, they probably felt, well, they're busy enough sitting there on Guadalcanal, and who were constantly in danger from the Japanese attack on Guadalcanal. But anyway, they wanted our 2 squadrons still sitting in Oahu to fly this mission. And it was a long mission, so we had to stop. And again, they want to, this time, the use of ground officers and ground crews and so forth were more important. As a matter of fact, almost necessary, because we were flying to a barren island, barren in terms of military equipment and supplies. And we weren't going to go there and just fly in and fly out. We were going to sit 2 or 3 weeks and bomb other places down in that area. So we had to take a lot of ground personnel, crowding the aircraft considerably just to get in there. So they flew these 2 squadrons, mostly the 372nd, which by coincidence was the one I was in, and some of the 371st. So we flew first to Canton Island, which had a fairly large American base, airport, and from Canton to this little burg. You can find it on a map, but it's just a pinpoint, Funafuti. So that's geographically, at least, and historically, I hope, some of the answers to your question.
Yeah. Well, we hold for a second. I'm going to switch tapes here.
Okay.
Because
You got to write this all up when this is over, and you should write your own experiences on
well,
it.
that's partly what we're doing. Okay. So your squadron's at Funafuna, is that right?
Funafuti.
Funafuti.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you're setting up camp there basically, right?
Right, and we were surprised because of all the things they told us to take along, every damn kind of tool you could imagine, and this sort of thing. And I was worried because, my God, I've always depended mostly on my enlisted crew to know some of these details, how to screw this damn thing, and because, but so I was surprised to find a contingent of Marines on that island. Mostly they were Marines and or sailors who did mechanical type of groundwork. Not entirely mechanical, but it was mostly ground support of airplanes. When we got there, we noticed there were 10 old fighter planes that were not useful at all, and why they were sitting there, I don't know. They were, here's where memory will trick me. They were about 1938 fighter planes. It won't come to me. And no longer useful in the war. And even with our modern planes of that date, the average zero is faster and better than the American fighters. And so but they were there. It surprised us to see them there. And so we were to stay there 2 or 3 weeks with other targets in addition to Nauru would be in our scope. And so we didn't set up any headquarters, but we did prepare for that type of stay. We all lived in tents down there, and a couple, 3 tents would have been no more than, say, a garage. Tools would be there and so forth to keep them dry as possible. And I should emphasize this was an extremely small island. It was really called, in geographical terms, an atoll, A-T-T-O-L. And this meant primarily it was a type of island that was mostly beach and not the typical South Pacific jungle. And as a result of that, there were coconut orchards. That's my term, not there, where they grew coconut trees and had a few banana trees, but primarily coconuts. And this is why the movie South Pacific was so alluring to me, because it reminded me so much of this island.
So was this island inhabited before?
Primarily with Polynesians, and they would have an occasional French, most of them, a French manager, supervisor, and some of his staff running the plantations here. But in general, it was compared to big islands, it was a very small island. And as I mentioned, and which is basic part of my story, for years, the residents there were 100% pure Polynesians, where on this type of island, if you read history books, that eventually filled Hawaii as they moved northeast and lived in Hawaii. That's where the Polynesians started. And of course, over years, many of them have filtered their purity by marital relations with other races and so forth. But these were, for generation after generation, pure Polynesian and excellent people, just lovely people, which is a point I wanted to emphasize when you're ready to hear about it, getting to know these people. And I should, as a rather human, funny type of experience, our flight surgeon, our doctor in our squadron, was from a very wealthy southeastern tobacco family. And he remembers as a child when his family had a cruise in the South Pacific. Back that many years ago, very few people could afford a cruise, but they went to the Far East that way. And they stopped at some of these small atoll places. And he remembered that the women particularly, made most of their garments out of what was called lava, which was cotton goods. And you can picture a native woman. They have a long dress that comes down, no shape or anything else. They just fit it over their shoulder. But they loved that cotton stuff to make their dresses out of. And he says, we ought to try to get some lava before we take off, if that's where we're going to go, and we can trade it with the natives. Okay, so we all bought about $10 worth of lava and carried with us in our little bags what we were allowed to carry. And sure enough, when we got down there, and we began to enjoy talking with these natives, and the men were, the whole island was so glad we were there, helpful to us, and just delighted to see us. And they'd come down to the strip and look at these airplanes. You know, they never saw an airplane examined. Boy, you put an airplane, you know. They didn't know anything about the war. They hardly knew there was a war, except they were glad we were Americans. And and the men were very graceful as well as helpful. They would climb the trees every morning, bring us coconuts, and they could open a coconut to give us milk quicker than I can open a tin can with a and so we'd drink their coconut milk in the mornings and stuff like that. And they couldn't do enough for us. And they were very strangely athletic, which several of us admired that. They could stand around, this is their own game, they'd stand around in a circle, and they were tremendous people in making things out of the fiber of coconut limbs and stuff like that, all the green stuff. So they made a ball, like a softball, out of this material, the vegetation. They stand around in a group and kick this ball to each other off the ground a little bit, and never let the damn thing drop. It was amazing. We would, in our clumsy way, try to do that. Hell, nobody was, even some of the star basketball players, none of them could do that sort of thing. And they could kick it over their back and turn around real quick and kick it again. It was fantastic. And they would insist on one of us to get in a line, and they'll show. We couldn't compete with that kind of stuff at all. So, but they had fun. When we would drop the thing right away, they'd laugh at us, you know, but they were so friendly and helpful. So this was important to us because it was part of the tragedy that came later and how you felt about it. So anyway, we were there preparing for the mission and working with the Marines. And one of the incidental things which became important, because I had to get around to all these planes and sometimes visit the bomb dump that the Marines had there temporarily, some of the fuses that they didn't understand and so forth, bomb fuses. And so I couldn't handle all this just walking around. We didn't bring any trucks or anything. They loaned me one of their trucks, an ordnance type of truck, which brought bombs to aircraft. And so I had this truck. And it was useful to me at night because in the evenings, first we put up our tents as quickly as we could, and they weren't severely anchored or as careful as you might if you're going to stay there very long. And the wind at night would have a tendency to blow the damn tent. It might even blow it down. So these are big tents where 16 could sleep in. And not 16, there were 8 could sleep in. And by bringing that truck in at night, I would tie one of the strings of the tent in the back to a wheel of this truck, and everybody was happy I had that there so the tent wouldn't blow down. So anyway, so they loaned me a truck and stuff. And so we went on for a few days in preparation of this first mission, which was to Nauru, which was about, this might be inaccurate because I don't remember exactly, roughly 1,000 miles away, I think. Or less than that, I think, about 800 miles away. So that was it, and finally the mission took off, and it was a complete success. There was no, very little, there was no fighter planes over there protecting them, and there was some ground fire from cannons that they had, but nothing serious enough to hit anybody. A few holes they discovered in some of the planes, but nothing serious.
And again, you were bombing, what was on Nauru again? What was it that
they were phosphate mines, which seems so insignificant, except that they can't make, the Japanese could not make ammunition unless they had phosphate. So it was very important to them. It's strange they didn't have more protection there for those mines, but maybe like us, they made their mistakes too. But in any event, the bombs were accurate, most of them, and the pictures justify the explosions, and a lot of the bombs were hit and caved in and stuff like that. So everybody was very joyful with our very first combat mission, and it came out so successfully. Well then, and we, in a sense, sort of anticipated, well, we'd be leaving, getting back to Hawaii now. Oh, we were so successful. Got a message from the high command that they want us to bomb another island now. And the other island turned out to be the very important, famous, well, even then was famous island of, if I forget it, I'm going to fall out of this chair, but it's part of my memory problem.
It's okay, it'll come over time.
Oh, I've got to mention this island to you because everybody knows about it. It's probably in my notes, but God, it's like trying to remember somebody's name. I'll remember it 99% of the time until I have to think of it, and then it won't clock.
That's why I always tell people, just stop thinking about it and talk on it a bit, it'll come to you.
All right, you're probably right. And at any event, this was got to be a very famous island. Are we on tape yet?
Yeah.
I didn't.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. No, I'm rolling here.
I would have been more careful.
Oh, that's okay.
This was a very famous island, and extremely well fortified by the Japanese, as it was later proven to be. They had huge underground fortifications, not only out of heavy palm tree logs,
Not Iwo.
but
Iwo Jima? No.
no, that's much later and
Yeah.
much more north.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Iwo was about 44, 45. My notes would show me what this island
Go ahead. In fact, I'll stop down here.
This-
Okay.
Okay.
So we are recording now.
Now we're recording. So this mission, it was so successful that the high command at that time, the 7th Air Force headquarters back in Honolulu, wanted us to do another mission, and it turned out to be Tarawa, which was somewhat frightening because that had already been well known as a very heavy Japanese base, and to back up for a minute, Tarawa was the main, as far as the Japanese fortresses were concerned, the main base of the Gilbert Islands. Now, Admiral Nimitz, who in my view was a great man, had realized that before they could progress very far west in terms of reaching Japan eventually, they had to go through the Gilbert Islands. And the foremost eastern island of the Gilberts was Tarawa. So that's the mission that we were assigned. We were to be as it happened, the first outfit to bomb Tarawa, or even come close to it, because we didn't know for sure how many fighter planes they had, for example, and those things. So anyway, we loaded up the planes and prepared for the mission to Tarawa. It was, Tarawa was just about as far northeast from Funafuti as Nauru had been northwest of Funafuti. So as it turned out, the mission was quite successful as far as getting there and back with no planes, no crews lost, and bombs landed generally in the right places, and so on and so forth. Experts later figured that bombing missions of Tarawa by anybody at any time generally were not too successful because of the rebutments and protection that they had built in there over several years. Heavy concrete underground types of places and so forth. They learned that specifically from Navy bombardment, who bombarded that island I don't know how many days or weeks before Marines were sent to take it, but they found out how little damage had really been done. And practically speaking, no major deaths on the part of the Japanese defenders of that island. They were so well protected. This led my knowledge, as the knowledge that would go through the troops, of the mistakes the Navy had made in eventually having Marines to take that island, and unnecessary deaths. All because, I don't know whether you want me to go into this, because I will condemn it all my existing life. The admiral who led the flotilla of American ships that went in there, lying offshore while they got ready to attack Tarawa, mostly the Marines. We're sitting out there for a day or two when one of the native chiefs and a couple of his aides rowed out to this ship where the admiral would be stationed. And in my humble effort to imitate a native chief, he shouted up to one of the Navy lieutenants who wondered what this guy in this rowboat down there wanted. Me want to speak with big chief, big American chief. What he wanted to relate to the big American chief was that these tides are very tricky and not normal type of tides coming into this bay. You have to be very careful of this. The lieutenant got the message to the admiral. The admiral said in my ugly parlance, "Tell the SOB to get the hell out of here. I'm too busy to see him." When the day came that these poor Marine kids were lowered off the ship down the ropes and ready to, with a 75-pound pack and a rifle and ammunition, to wade in to shore at, quotes, low tide, they went into the water into the ocean with the water up to their neck, to their chin, trying to wade through to the shore, while the Japanese sat there with their machine guns on the beach, mowing them down right and left. This illustration, again, there were magazine journalists along, and the very first huge picture of dead Marines lying 1, 2, 3, right up to 100, lying dead on the beach, was the first time, and on the front cover of Life magazine, first time that the Americans realized how many people were going to be killed over there. And you see, it still grabs me after 50 years. I hate to think of those dead kids. It's funny, after 50 years, this grips hold of me. So it was terrible, and so with great loss of marine life, the island was finally taken, captured, Tarawa, and it was very important because it cleared the air, literally the air, as well as ships from going through the Gilberts to progress the war westward. So that was their aim. My criticism is this admiral that ignored these straight information on the tides and let those kids get in chin up, chin high. So,
do you think that was that he ignored it because he was an admiral and this was a peon that was telling him, or because he was an American and this was some foreigner telling him?
Probably part of that. I certainly wouldn't dismiss it. What did this guy know about tides? Hell, I went to Annapolis. I know all about tides. As a matter of fact, it reminds me again that on many of the islands in the South Pacific, when they were about to be attacked by American forces, their guide to the plateaus and valleys and the geography in general of this particular island was taken from magazines that they would bring along. They had no knowledge of the geography of these islands, which cost a lot of lives eventually. But that's how innocent we were, especially in the early parts of the war. As innocent as the 7th Air Force was of sending us down to this island, no anticipation that we might be bombed back and might even be taken as prisoners if they would allow us to live, but certainly captured and killed probably. So anyway, we bombed Tarawa, and it too was successful. So they decided after a second mission on Tarawa, we would then fly back to Hawaii and regroup back there. So, meanwhile, the Japanese had, in their wisdom, had decided they'd had enough of this crazy bombing. Where did these characters come from? They searched their own maps out and realized the only place possible was this little island of Funafuti. So they sent a couple of scout planes over. Sure enough, God, they got down there on that strip down there, tons of bombers and everything else. So one night as we were sleeping a few days later, peaceful and top of the world, we just did these successful bombing missions and so forth, we began to hear the explosions of bombs dropping. At first, somewhat in the distance, maybe a couple hundred yards away, but they began to get closer. In the meantime, I should tell you this. There was one fella assigned to sleep in our tent. We were 5 or 6 ground officers in this tent. And he came along. We didn't know him. He was, as we found out eventually, he was from the Adjutant General's office of the 7th Air Force. And he was a young lawyer, and he was to work with the chiefs, or whatever you might want to call them, of the community living on this island, to negotiate with them any cross purposes in terms of what land we would be occupying to set up our own stuff, and all the other things that they felt they might need somebody, an attorney, to negotiate with the chiefs of the island, as I say, and work out peacefully whatever, if they wanted compensation or whatever. So he was in our tent too. And it's not that all of us who were part of the bomb group were that much used to bombing raids. We'd been in Hawaii. We had no bombing raids in Hawaii. So when we heard these bombs falling, nevertheless, we knew enough to get our ass out of that cot as quick as we could. But where do we go? Where do we run? Christ, there's no foxholes, no preparation, no realization that we were going to be bombed or anything. There wasn't a place to run to for safety's sake, except we were fairly close to part of the plantation, coconut plantation, where they had just planted young palm trees. They were just maybe a foot or two high. Down on our knees we just got and began like dogs digging the sand out with our hands as the bombs began to get closer and closer. I might say, incidentally, I was hit by shrapnel from one of those first bombs. And of course it hurt like hell, but not crippling me. And I was bleeding, but I kept digging, fortunately, and not stopping, because we realized we had to get below the surface of the ground to escape the shrapnel from these bombs. Which were big bombs. I estimated them later, at least 500-pound bombs hitting. And they can do a lot of damage, believe me, as we found out later, to our aircraft. So we were there digging. But this poor guy, and I wanted to mention his name, who was almost like a civilian in terms of us ragged people in the army, already in the service. He was pretty slow. He got off, put on his shoes and socks. Never made it to the foxhole. He made it on his hands and knees, groaning and whining. I don't think he felt the pain. He was bleeding like a stuffed pig, and he got to the hole where 2 of us had dug enough to get below the surface. He comes in, crawls in, and lands on top of me, bleeding to death. Talk about suffering that was one of my worst psychological moments, is this poor guy couldn't move and he was dying there, which he died eventually. We didn't know his name even. We didn't know who he was, where he was from, or anything. Seemed like a nice fellow, but we never got to know him. And so the next morning, which some of those pictures in the magazine illustrate, why we were looking over our problems. The bombing truck that I had mentioned earlier that I had borrowed from the Marines and was tying down our tent, one of the bombs hit that truck and blew it up. It was a heavy truck with mechanisms on it to make it add to the weight of it. Threw it over, I'd estimate, maybe 30 feet, and landed on a foxhole where two of our combat crew guys were in, and killed them both. This gave me a lot of guilt because I was the one that put that truck there. Excuse me.
That's okay. Just no hurry. Take your time to.
And of course, everybody was saying, "Oh, it wasn't your fault," stuff like that. But nevertheless, you'll keep figuring, if you hadn't put that damn truck there, it wouldn't have killed these two guys. Well, there were more than those two guys killed. We lost several flight people on that. And a lot of people far worse wounded than me. My wound was, it hurt, it stung, and I knew I had a problem there, but it wasn't that serious. And the doctor, a flight surgeon, fixed me up the best he could and so forth, and the next morning, and so it wasn't that bad. But what was bad was I should throw this in. I can see I'm not in sequence as I relate to
That's
you.
okay.
This island was first discovered, so to speak, by an Irish navigator named O'Neill. He was from Ireland and way back in early 1800s doing a navigation job. Came on, and as a Catholic person from Ireland, started the Catholic religion, so to speak. In whatever shape he started is not important, but they became religious. And he also instigated their desire to build a chapel, which they used some type of, not cement, but alabaster or whatever you might call it. And it turned out to be quite white as they built this chapel. Well, it wasn't huge, but it was enough for about, guessing 150, 200 people to come in and sit down in. And of course, along with their religious feelings, they believed that if you ever had a problem, you ever had trouble, go to the chapel, that'll help you out. Well, when this gleaming white building, which was used by the Japanese as their bombing point because it stood out on this moonlight night, and they wasted no time in destroying that chapel with their bombs and with these people sitting in there. So the next morning, a message, if I lived to be 300, would always remember the whining, the groaning, the members of the community who were not only badly hurt, but those who lost their members of their family and so forth. It was just a fantastic situation, utterly unbelievable. As I watched it, it was unbelievable. And the primary thought that crawled through my mind, if not at that moment, but certainly soon afterwards, that here is this wonderful group of peaceful people, bright, intelligent, cooperative, in between two so-called civilized nations who are doing the fighting over this little stinking island, and all these people killed and wounded for that reason. A horrible memory that I have of that. was so impressed with it that later on, after I got back to Hawaii, I wrote a memorandum to an author who was famous for this sort of thing, and I'm going to sit here and forget his name. One of the world's most famous current authors. He's written many books of which I've read. The first book he wrote turned out later to be the movie South Pacific. He wrote about his first experience on the South Sea Islands, and he wrote books called Hawaii, he wrote books called Alaska, Chesapeake Sound, Texas.
I know who you're talking about.
World famous author. Anyway, I wrote him to say he ought to do a story on this, and I finally, after about 3 months later, had a note from his secretary. Thank you so much. I can understand all this, but Mr. does his own research on all occasions, and we would have to go through our own research before we wrote a book on it. So at least they acknowledged my letter, but that led to that, because I thought this was such a worldwide moral example of what, not all the horrors of war are, as I mentioned earlier, fought on the sea in a battleship or on a battleground of infantry or in an aircraft. All these kind of horrors are, relatively speaking, not noticed. And all these innocent citizens on the ground. So that was such a deplorable situation, and typical of locking the barn after the horse is stolen. The Navy finally sent some small ships to bring off the island all those that still lived. A lot good that did them, but I have never known. I should try to do some research of my own to see if those families ever moved back to that island, or if the memories were too horrible to want them to do that. So anyway, that was my memory of that little island. And then we went back to Hawaii, and talk about salt on a wound. Everybody in high command was so happy with our success down there on these 2 or 3 bombing missions, 4, I think, 2 on each island, and gave just about everybody who wanted it a 4-day leave, and you could go to Honolulu. Where our camp was on the other end of Oahu, if you know Oahu, from where Honolulu's on the south, Hickam Field, and we were on the extreme north end.
North Shore.
And North Shore, right.
Yeah.
And so that meant bumming a Jeep or some type of automobile to get into Honolulu. So 4 of us who were on that mission in Funafuti decided to go together. We got a room at the old Moana Hotel, which is right near Waikiki. In those days, there were only 2 hotels at Waikiki. Now there must be 52. And I'm not ashamed to say we drank ourselves silly in 4 days there. So the 4th day we were there, I think it was the 4th day, some military police came into the bar room where we were sitting and yelling for members of the 307th Bomb Group. And we finally identified ourselves. You guys have to get back to your base immediately, not later, immediately. And we're here to make sure you do. Oh, wait a minute, Sergeant, what are you talking about? We're 4 officers who just came back. I don't care, sir, what you are or who you are. Get your ass, all of you, back quickly. Of course, we were all over town. I'm just speaking of the 4 of us in that bar, but at least that was their job to get us back. Well, back we went. We found out that the 2 squadrons were to fly to Midway with the possible word that possibly another another Japanese task force was headed for Midway. Now this was following that huge Midway battle where the Americans were so successful, but it was a tremendous battle, and of course, we were very fortunate to be in the right place at the right time. Especially fortunate because the Japanese admiral who put all the wrong planes on deck at the wrong time, so that he couldn't get fighter planes off to attack the American planes. But in any event, Midway was certainly well known, and it wasn't too long ago that had occurred before we were ordered to get back and take off for Midway. And we didn't know whether Midway was going to be the final place that we go, or are the crews to take off and go somewhere else, or what. But anyway, we headed for Midway. And I'll never forget that one of the intelligence officers, who was a few years older than I, incidentally, at 26, I was one of the grandpas of our squadron. Their kids were all 20, 21 years old. But Bill was probably in his mid-30s. He must have been 34, 35, and he was eventually the mayor of Indianapolis. He was an attorney, and he was head of the intelligence function in our squadron. So Bill and I and a couple others landed together, and the first thing we began to do was dig a foxhole, because if we had remembered that we failed to have any on Funafuti. So we dug a very deep foxhole and sat back and just waited to see what the hell was going to happen. And so fortunately, in about 2 days, the word came that instead of the Japanese going to attack us, they had already landed at Sitka. I think it was Sitka, in Alaska, and had removed their troops from Alaska. That this was a big feint towards Midway, while in the meantime their ships went and unloaded their infantry off of Sitka. It was Sitka and perhaps another place, I don't want to be absolutely correct, but I know it was one of those islands in Alaska. And that was a big faux pas on American intelligence, because they lost sight of where the Japanese mission went. And never
It sounds
bothered.
like there was a lot of, I don't know if a lot, I mean, again, we read history and they talk about how skilled we were, yet within our skilled military, we made a lot of mistakes. We still had a lot of communication problems. We had a lot of social issues to deal with too, it sounds like.
That's true, and a lot of us have talked about that over time. You're together 3 years in the damn jungle, what do you do? So we talk about all these things, and there's no question about it, even with understanding and forgiveness about these high command decisions. You had to think back, well, hell, most of these guys who were now majors, lieutenant colonels, whatever, they'd only been in service maybe a year or more or less. They had no combat experience. They were making major decisions, like whoever made the decision to send us down to Funafuti without any thought that we might be attacked and the whole damn. I didn't even mention yet the false rumor we had on Funafuti that the Japanese were sending a platoon over to capture the island. Oh God, I didn't mention that. You talk about anxiety. The head of that little Marine contingent was only a captain, because there weren't that many people there. He decided, when this rumor became so alive and came over and told us all about it, he began to decide what we should all do. And we all had to go up to the northern end of the island and start building some barricades as quickly as we could, cut down palm trees, load them up in front of us with sandbags and so on and so forth. We knew this would all be silly, because if they sent over a platoon of Japanese infantry to capture us, Christ, every damn one of us would be dead in 10 minutes. There's no question about it. And so we had to live with that for a couple of days until that rumor simmered away, until we were able to get the hell off of here.
That's kind of amazing to think of you being out on this island in the middle of nowhere, and rumors like that still being able to get. And this was before the internet, so.
Yeah, right. Yes, indeed. It was a rumor, of course, but it made sense. Why shouldn't they capture this island? They should have captured it long before, but it would have taken no major effort on the part of those guys, and we would have Yeah, I'm sorry, I apologize for thinking of things and going
No,
back.
that's fine, that's fine.
Because this raises another horrendous problem for us. All our planes were shattered. They took a couple of planes right away to fly back, some to Canton, which was a fairly large base, and back to Hawaii to take the dead and the wounded to a hospital. The dead, of course, for whatever services they had to go through. But so we lost a couple of planes that were able to fly, and they immediately, nobody groaned about that. That's what they should have done. So they took back the worst wounded and the dead as soon as they could. That left us with not enough planes to carry back the personnel. Also, some of the planes that were still flyable were so shattered with shrapnel sitting there on the ground that the instruments weren't working. We were, all of us, assigned to different planes for passage back to Hawaii. And it meant that we were going to have to stand bumper to bumper all the way back. And lucky if they could squeeze that many in. I'm talking about roughly over 100 ground personnel, all those guys that had to come to fly the planes, and some combat crews whose planes were shot. I mean, all those people, except the actual working crew of a bomber, everybody else was going to be a passenger standing up there. We didn't mind stamping up. We stood on our heads to get off this damn island because meanwhile they kept flying single bombers over our island. And every time we heard the damn motors grinding away up there, we had learned in the meantime the Japanese had two major bombers, the Helens and the Bettys. That was their numbers. We could almost tell by the grinding of their engines which one they were. And we would hear these Helens. Hell, they weren't only 3,000 or 4,000 feet over us. And we were down here on the strip. Everybody tried to do their damnedest to get this plane working. And they would fly over, we would all run like crazy down to the beach and start digging a hole again down on the beach. Anything. Well, they didn't drop bombs anymore on us. They should have, probably, but they didn't. But we knew they were around and available anytime they wanted to come in there. So, meanwhile, these good, capable pilots, I was assigned to, forget his first name, Captain Phillips, nice guy, pilot of this plane. And I knew Phil real well, and so finally, those of us who were scheduled for his plane were told to get aboard, ready for takeoff. Phillips started his engines and then turned them off. Says, we can't fly in this. I says, Phil, what the hell are you telling us? You can't fly this airplane. The motor sounded great and everything. He said, it's not indicating properly. And I can't get any correct signals out of here at all. And I just can't fly you guys 2,000 miles to the nearest island, Canton. And well, these wonderful ground crews get so little recognition in the Air Force. At night with their flashlights and little screwdrivers and everything, go through these shrapnel-loaded airplanes to find out where wires had been cut by shrapnel. And I don't know how they could do it, but somehow or other they got all these damn wires to connect and so on and so forth. So in that method of great anxiety, everybody wanted to get in a plane. I told Phil, I don't give a goddamn if this plane doesn't even tell you you're off the ground. Let's get in it and take off. And everybody felt that way because we expected the Japanese to actually fulfill this rumor. They would come and capture the whole damn island. So he took off finally. And when he could read his board properly, and we flew into Canton, and it was the middle of the night. And in the meantime, as we learned later, Canton had also been bombed, not seriously, but they had enough to know that the Japanese were looking for where these damn planes had come from. And so they were alert. So we were no sooner coming in on Canton, the place was black as coal, because everybody turned their lights off, of course, and they had sent up night fighters, what were they, P-71, I think they call them, to shoot down any enemy airplanes. Among other signals that were not working on his panel was our IFF, which indicates friend or foe. And it wasn't working, and it wasn't important for Phil to use that to fly his planes, but it just didn't work. So here comes a P-71 to shoot us down, and the son of a gun fires a shot, and to this day, I don't know whether he missed us on purpose or accidentally, but you could see that damn shot coming at us. It missed us. Meanwhile, our alert radio operator got hold of the base. The base, in turn, got hold of that 71 and said, for Christ's sake, that's a B-24. So that was all we needed for an extra little bit of anxiety.
That's where that whole aspect of war seems so confusing and overwhelming and
full of mistakes and things like that, yeah.
Yeah, especially during World War II with the technology. I mean, I'm sure it's probably not any better today, really, with technology. But you know, like you said, you had amazing ground technicians putting these things back together, being able to stay in contact with each other, making decisions back and forth, and nobody really, you know, and you're in territory that a lot of people from the U.S. had never been to, these little islands, and
Yeah.
who's who and who are you shooting at, and you know, and then like you said, the saddest thing is the third party, the Polynesians, this wasn't their war.
No.
They were out on this island in the middle of nowhere harvesting coconuts,
Mm-hmm.
and we come in and negotiate a deal and use their island
Mm-hmm.
to protect our lands, and Japan's trying to take our lands and
Mm-hmm.
back and forth, and yet they're the ones that, you know, a lot of their population got annihilated by.
You put it very well. And my main emphasis in being pleased to come and talk with you was my feeling about the natives. These other incidentals come to view, but these are more how it affects us as part of the U.S. services. But the poor Polynesians were not a part of anything. They were just innocently on that wrong island. But you're right. All those kind of things that happen and are not really realized by the average American.
After the island was bombed, and again, the sad part being that the Whitechapel was the bombing target,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where they went to, you know, for safety or security.
Yeah.
Did you leave the island so quick that you didn't then have contact with the people, the Polynesians that were left, or did you have contact, and if so, what was their feeling towards all this?
That's a good question. I wish I could answer it more completely. I'd say the following morning, when we viewed our own wreckage, and when we first saw all those damaged B-24s on that strip down there, Jesus, which wasn't that far from us, but it was probably half a mile. We just had no occasion to go down there, but we finally, when we recovered our own wounds and took some of the dead guys out and so forth, going down there and seeing, I couldn't believe it. Half the planes we came down here on were scraps of nothing. So, but anyway, get back to your question. The poor agony, the agony of these poor people. I mean, first of all, so mystified at a bombing. I mean, at airplanes that dropped bombs. I mean, this was unknown to them. They had no way of knowing all this thing going on, and these things falling from the sky and exploding and killing people. It was just a fantastic scene. All of these people, I would say, and I have to guess, but there must have been roughly only 1,000, maybe 1,500 people living there on this place. It was that small, and they were such lovely people. We enjoyed them, and such beautiful people. The men were handsome, the girls were lovely, and the fun we would have bargaining with them over 2-yard lava lava, 2 fans. Oh no, 3-yard lava lava. They would laugh and say 3-yard. They were already bargainers, and so we enjoyed that type of getting to know them and so forth. And then to see that whole group wailing and moaning and groaning and seeing their dead family members and stuff, utterly fantastic and unbelievable. Unbelievable, really. Where am I, standing here watching this sort of thing? God. So no, to answer your question, that once we were prepared to leave and trying to get prepared to leave, there was not too much contact. And as I mentioned, in a couple of days, the Navy came and removed all the people still on the natives on the island. They took them off, and made me think of the locking the farmer's barn after the horses were already stolen. But so that was the end of our contact there. And just to finish the story, after we got back to Hawaii and after we got back to from Midway again, settled down from that, they decided to, as I mentioned earlier, 2 of our squadrons had already gone south to Guadalcanal. They decided to move the 2 squadrons that were still in Hawaii down to Guadalcanal too. So that was the beginning of a new experience in terms of watching Marines capturing Guadalcanal. It never made me very happy when this movie came along, something about the Red String, I can't remember not the Private Ryan movie.
Oh, yeah,
But
yeah.
the one that followed up.
Yeah.
It made me upset because it glorified the Army division that came in to capture Guadalcanal, but the people who delivered Guadalcanal was these kids of the U.S. Marine, 17, 18, 19-year-old kids getting killed by the bushel. And they invented a lot of the jungle fighting that followed services. You don't fight in jungles by going in squads right, squads left, the old Army style. You crawl in on your belly and you dig out of the shrubbery, these Japanese. You shoot them out of trees and stuff like that. And that's the way that fighting went on. There were times when Henderson Field was our main field at that time. And later the gallant Navy service of sending in their engineers to build another airstrip. We had a second airstrip. But Henderson Field, on many a morning, our crews were lined up for takeoff down at one end of the field. They got a signal to lie on their bellies and wait because it wasn't for sure who controlled the strip on the other end, the Japanese or the Americans. So they had to wait to see which infantry function, Japanese or American, controlled the airfield. That was really something. And of course, the U.S. Navy were, at that time, it was also dangerous because we were bombed by Japanese ships at sea, and captain after captain of these American battleships was relieved of duty because they couldn't hit anything with their torpedoes. Speaking of how slow the American science part caught up with the battles, well, it wasn't the fact that the captains were not shooting straight enough for their torpedoes to work. It was a matter that the fuses on the damn torpedoes, which were the type of fuse that would go off, there's a word for it, and I forget it.
Compression? No.
Nearness.
Oh, okay.
Nearness to location. Their trouble was their torpedoes were going right under the ships and not going off. That was the problem. It took the Navy several months before they discovered it. Meanwhile, all these poor captains had been fired and rated, sunk in their ratings and so forth, and because they weren't shooting straight. But anyway, it was very dangerous from that point of view. The Japanese were, at that time, in command of the sea, and as well as many other things down in that area. And but it was finally, Guadalcanal was the first island captured that was significant in clearing the way for the rest of the war in the South Pacific. during those years, incidentally, we were under the command in the South Pacific of Admiral Halsey, who we all thought a lot of. He was a daring old character and could be informal with everybody else when he wanted to be. And eventually MacArthur was rescued and taken to Australia, and eventually became commander of the Southwest Pacific. That was the first time the South Pacific was different from the Southwest Pacific in terms of combat areas. But as the war went west, we eventually became under the command of MacArthur instead of Halsey. We all missed Halsey, and I had never found anybody who cared much for MacArthur, who was such a showboat. He was a real showboat. And in any event, that's the way it went. So that's the most of my story. And as I say, to convey to you the sorrow of those wonderful natives being killed and so innocent of this whole thing, that was the major reason that I'm glad I had the opportunity to sit with you. And you